Welcome to the Educator Podcast, Walking History, where we explore the history around us by actually walking it. I'm your host, Matt Douglas, former history teacher, longtime educator, and life coach for teens and young adults. Yesterday, I walked the battlefield at the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the First Battle of Manassas, the first major battle of the American Civil War. It truly is a unique and fascinating story. This is Walking History, the First Battle of Bull Run. All right, welcome everybody. So today we're talking about the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas or the First Battle of Manassas. We're going to start with a quick summary here to just go over the basic facts of the battle as they took place. So the First Battle of Bull Run took place on July 21st, 1861, near the town of Manassas, Virginia, about 25 miles west-southwest of Washington, D.C. It was the first major battle of the Civil War, and about 3 months after the initial shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter on April 12th and 13th of 1861. So the North had been pressuring Lincoln and his army for a swift, decisive victory over the South, and this battle takes place as Union troops are beginning their march, started in mid-July, from Washington, D.C., towards Richmond, the Confederate capital, which was just over 100 miles away. Manassas, Virginia was the site of a very important railway junction in Confederate territory on that road to Richmond, so the Union really wanted to capture it, and the Confederacy would defend it at all costs. Northern and Southern troops, each with just over 30,000 men, although very inexperienced, many having just enlisted weeks before, would encounter each other near the Manassas Railroad Junction next to a small river called Bull Run. That's where you get both of those names. The majority of the battle would take place on what is a large, flat hilltop called Henry Hill. It was the largest battle in U.S. history up to that time, and initially it appeared the Union troops had the upper hand and Confederate troops were on the retreat, but as we'll see, the very disorganized and poorly trained Union troops, combined with a stream of Confederate reinforcements, would turn the tide of the battle, and by late afternoon, the Union troops were fleeing the battlefield in an absolute rout back towards Washington, D.C. This was a major victory for the Confederates and an embarrassing defeat for the North. And afterwards, both sides quickly began to increase the size of their armies, pour money, resources, and training into the war effort, and began to prepare for what increasingly seemed likely to become a very long, protracted, drawn-out war. Before we get into the actual battle itself, I always like to start with some interesting facts, and this battle is absolutely chock full of them. So the first interesting fact here is that you may have heard of the famous Confederate commander Stonewall Jackson. Well, before this battle, he was simply known as Thomas J. Jackson. He received his famous nickname of Stonewall at this battle. The battle is known in the North as the First Battle of Bull Run, and in the South as the First Battle of Manassas, or First Manassas. And as you'll see through most of the Civil War, the North tends to name the battles after the closest body of water or river, while the South tends to name their battles after the closest town. So the practice kind of begins here with this battle. This battle is also home to some absolutely absurd scenery. We'll talk about this more as we get towards the end of the battle, but Northern citizens and many politicians, thinking this battle was going to be like a splendid, entertaining affair, actually came to the battlefield to watch the show. That it was going to be entertainment. They had picnics, they were popping champagne. You got to imagine like politicians and rich people in their carriages with a picnic blanket on the ground watching the show. Well, they're watching this battle take place, and as we'll see towards the end, their naive revelry is famously and absolutely terrifyingly dashed when the Northern troops, having fled the scene of the battle, stream past their carriages and their wagons and their picnics, running for their lives, and these citizens are caught up in the battle in the end of it, basically running for their lives too. We'll talk about it towards the end of this discussion here in the battle, but it is absolutely an almost comical scene that takes place. And then lastly, my favorite crazy, absolutely absurd fact of the Civil War, and maybe one of my favorite crazy facts in world history as a whole, begins here. And it is the story of the poor Virginia grocer, Wilmer McLean. McLean had a farm near Manassas, Virginia, and as Confederate troops reached the area, it was commandeered by Confederate Brigadier General P.T. Beauregard to be used as his headquarters. Union artillery shell McLean's property, and a cannonball even drops through his fireplace. Now, McLean, as you can imagine, is terrified. He's seen the devastation of the Civil War literally start in his front yard. So he moves himself and his family to safety as far away from the dangerous crossroads where Union and Confederate forces would do almost constant battle for the next 4 years, to this very rural, out-of-the-way, safe, tranquil Virginia town of Appomattox Courthouse. Now, years later, as it happened, the war comes to an end in April 1865, and Confederate General Robert E. Lee and Union General Ulysses S. Grant are both in the area of Appomattox Courthouse, and they're looking for a suitable place to officially sign the Confederate surrender. They have this messenger walking around the area looking for a place that, works for this official historic surrender, and he arrives on Wilmer McLean's doorstep. He knocks on the door, and he requests to use McLean's home for the official surrender location of Confederate General Lee to Union General Grant. McLean reluctantly agrees. The war had found him again, and Lee famously surrenders to Grant in McLean's living room. And this time, he's perhaps worse off than he was before. So instead of a cannonball landing in his fireplace, after this surrender, Union troops began taking everything in his house that was not already nailed down for souvenirs. They take tables and chairs, anything they could grab, despite McLean's protests. They did at least pay him for his stuff as they ran out with it. Later, McLean, I can only imagine completely befuddled after unwittingly finding himself a fixture of U.S. history, was supposed to have famously said, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." And it certainly did. And I wouldn't believe it if it weren't part of history, but it absolutely took place. And there you go. So, without further ado, let's get to the battle itself. So, let's start with some context here. The war had basically just begun in April of 1861. And both sides were eager for war, and they both expected a quick and glorious victory. Everybody expected it to be over in a few months, with not so many shots fired. The North figured they'd rush over the South, capture Richmond and the territory, the South would surrender. The South figured that they would defeat the Northern forces quite quickly, and the North would just go away, and the war would be over. Now, obviously, one side was wrong. As it turns out, both sides ended up being wrong. So the war had basically just begun, and President Abraham Lincoln had called for 90-day volunteers back in April, meaning in April he'd asked people to volunteer for the military to serve for 90 days. Now, in July, their contract is about to run out. So their contract's about to run out, and then you have all this political and media and local popular pressure to get going and invade the South and capture Richmond. The New York Times, for example, famously has a bunch of headlines, "Forward to Richmond, forward to Richmond." There's this kind of groundswell of enthusiasm to just get the war going, get it over with, attack, invade, let's go, what are you waiting for? The problem was that most Union troops and their commanders were totally inexperienced. They had virtually no training. They were mostly farmers and townspeople, and they weren't soldiers. So the battle takes place, as we had said earlier, near the Manassas Rail Junction. And this is a very important train hub in the area. So it connects northern Virginia and essentially Washington, D.C. in the north to the Shenandoah Valley of the west, which we'll talk about more, and Richmond to the south, obviously the Confederate capital. If the Union could hold it, it would seriously hamper the Southern efforts to transport troops and goods and things like that. And it was a great strategic victory point on the way eventually to getting to Richmond. Now, obviously, the Confederates wanted to hold it for those exact same reasons, too. So, on July 16th, 1861, the Union General Irvin McDowell had about 33,000 or so troops, and they leave Washington, D.C. with all these cheers from the citizens. It's this great, exciting march to go end the Civil War that had just started. And they're embarking on this campaign to take the Confederate capital at Richmond. Now, nobody knew what to expect. The troops were very inexperienced and green. They were overconfident. They were naive. They just did not know what they were getting into. And you can't really blame them. How could anybody expect this war would last years and years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives and destroy much of the country? The first day, this is kind of funny to imagine, but the first day, the troops only marched 5 miles, as many of the soldiers stop along the way to pick berries and fill their canteens, and it's almost like a party. We're going to war. Obviously, by the end of this battle, they're going to have a much different interpretation of what's going on. It takes about 2 days, but on July 18th, McDowell's army reaches the town of Centerville in Virginia, which is the town adjacent to Manassas and that important train hub. About 5 miles ahead of it lay a stream, a small river known as Bull Run, and just beyond that sat about 22,000 Confederate troops under the command of General P.T. Beauregard, who had commanded the Confederate forces who took Fort Sumter. So he was already kind of a well-known figure in the Confederacy. So it's July 18th, July 19th, July 20th, and McDowell is attempting to get around the Confederate right flank, which means their right side. He's trying to get around it to attack them from the side, but he fails. So he spends the next few days in the area sending out scouting parties, trying to determine Confederate troop strength and placement, that kind of thing, and decide what he wants to do. Beauregard, the Confederate general, meanwhile, is set up in kind of a defensive position, waiting to see if there's going to be attack, and he sends word to Richmond of the situation and asks for reinforcements. He says, there might be a big battle here, I need some help. Now, Beauregard happens to be in luck. The Confederate troops had another 10 to 12,000 men stationed about 57 miles west of Manassas in the Shenandoah Valley, under the command of Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston, and as we'll see later in the battle here, they proved decisive. Now, Johnston's troops were stationed at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, to the west, protecting what is this sort of fertile breadbasket of the South. It's surrounded by mountains on the east and west, and if the Union Army had gotten through, not only could they burn thousands of acres of crops, which the South obviously needed, but they could also use it as sort of an avenue or a road to attack Richmond. Sort of another way to get to Richmond. About 18,000 Union troops under Major General Robert Patterson were opposing Johnston's troops, and what they were trying to do, if possible, was to invade the Shenandoah Valley. And at the very least, they knew they absolutely had to keep General Johnston's Confederate troops stuck there because they knew that the Union troops under McDowell were about to attack Manassas, and at all costs, they could not let additional Confederate reinforcements reach them. So Patterson's job essentially was keep Johnston's troops where they are, don't let them reinforce the Confederates at Manassas. Now, he fails at that, and we'll see how. For unknown reasons, we're not even quite sure why, he pulls his troops just out of reach of the Confederates. And screened by the Confederate cavalry under the command of Colonel Jeb Stuart, the main body of Johnston's forces, led by Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson, who we'll talk more about later, makes it to those trains. They make it to those trains, they board those trains, and they basically ride over to Manassas Railroad Junction as the battle is essentially already beginning. And as we'll see during the battle itself, literally some of these troops hop off a train, walk half a mile or a mile, and they're in the battle. They're like literally right there. So now the stage is basically set. You have Union troops under McDowell that are sort of prodding and probing the Confederate forces under Beauregard and trying to outflank them and then engage them. And then meanwhile, en route, you have Johnston's forces coming from the west by train to get to the battlefield. And the battle starts on the morning of July 21st. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Before we do, I just want to make a quick note of the different troop strengths and stats of the battle. I think it's important to contextualize it in this way. The North has about 35,000 total troops, but only about 18,000 are ever actually engaged in the battle itself. Now, there's some different numbers on statistics here. You might find different numbers depending on what source you use, but the source that I have said that there were 2,896 total casualties on the northern side. Casualties means killed, wounded, missing, and captured. There were 481 killed, 1,124 wounded, and 1,312 missing or captured. That is a pretty large number, especially for what was a very, very early battle in this war. The South had very similar numbers of troops, about 33,000 total troops, and again, only about 18,000 actively engaged in the battle. The rest were mostly those sort of sitting in defensive positions. Of those 33,000 total troops, there are about 1,982 total casualties, with 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, and 13 missing and captured. Now, I want you to compare real quick those last numbers there to the Northern forces. The South has 13 missing and captured. The North has 1,312 missing and captured. And that right there pretty much tells the entire story of the battle. So, let's get into it. So the battle officially starts at 5:30 a.m. on July 21st, 1861. Now, I walked the battlefield yesterday, and it is in remarkable condition. It's an incredible place to visit. You can sort of see the history there as you're walking it, and you can really picture and imagine exactly what was happening as the course of the battle takes place. So at 5:30 a.m., you have these Union troops sitting just east of this Bull Run River, this small stream, and the Confederates on the other side in a defensive position. Union artillery begins shelling at 5:30 a.m., and they begin shelling the Confederates near this place called Stonebridge. As we'll see, there's a lot of references to stone in this battle. There's a stone house and then stone wall. There's stone everywhere, but this is Stonebridge. And Stonebridge is still there. It was destroyed during the Civil War, but they rebuilt it a couple decades later. And you can actually still walk it right now, so you can literally visualize and picture sort of how this was going. So there's an important road going east to west, and Stonebridge is the bridge over this small river of Bull Run, and it's just east of where the battle actually ends up taking place. The reason for this artillery bombardment early in the morning was basically a ruse. It's called a feint. And what McDowell was trying to do was attack at Stonebridge, which sort of seemed like a natural crossing point of the Bull Run River, to confuse and trick the Confederates into thinking that's where the attack would be. And he wanted the Confederates to amass all their forces right around this Stonebridge, and that he could then sort of go around them and attack on their flank, on their side. So McDowell starts his artillery bombardment at 5:30 a.m. and then sends his forces north a few miles upriver, upstream of Bull Run, to cross at an unguarded crossing called Sudley Ford. And then from there, he was going to outflank the Confederate forces. The Confederates were not fooled. So this takes a few hours. There's artillery going off for a few hours in the morning. And then at around 10 a.m., you have the first actual contact of the battle. And I just want to kind of give you a visual of the battlefield here so you can picture it in your head. Basically, there's long, kind of flowing, rolling hills throughout the countryside. It's partially farmland, partially forest. And the battle itself basically runs north to south with this stone bridge on the east. It almost kind of makes like a T. And the Union troops cross at Sudley Ford, and they come due south and hit a hill called Matthews Hill. Now, Matthews Hill is still there. It's really remarkably well kept up, and you could see the entire battlefield from that point. It's sort of a long rolling pasture hill with a few trees mixed in. And so the Union forces are marching due south across these rolling hills to engage the Confederate forces. And Union Colonel Ambrose Burnside is leading the charge, and his troops reach Matthews Hill, and it sort of overlooks this large cornfield to the south, and that's where the Confederate troops are. So Ambrose sets up 6 cannons and begins attacking the Confederates to drive them back. The Confederate force is much smaller, but they put up remarkable and very stiff resistance. They even occasionally charge the Union troops. Confederate troops were kind of known for being kind of crazy, and that rebel yell, that chant, that scream, they were known for doing kind of daring deeds in battle. But more and more of McDowell's troops reach the battlefield, and the tide starts to turn in favor of the North. There's just more and more Northern troops and not that many Southern forces. So by the minute, more Union troops are arriving, and after about 90 minutes of fighting, the Confederate forces are forced to retreat due south about a mile to the next large hill, Henry Hill, which is where the real battle takes place, and we'll talk much more about in a moment. Now, at this time, the Union is elated. They think they've won. General McDowell even triumphantly proclaims, "Victory, victory, the day is ours." He thinks they have won the battle, and maybe even they won the war. Of course, he is sorely mistaken, and this is the absolute farthest thing from the truth. So this first engagement started around 10 a.m. At about 11:30 a.m., the engagement kind of ends. Those Confederate forces are retreating. They're pretty disorganized, and we're running due south towards this Henry Hill, which is named after the Henry family that occupies a farm there. Now, there's some Confederate artillery on that hill. They are shooting at some of the Union forces to kind of cover their retreat. But for the moment, it kind of seems like the Confederate forces are disorganized and retreating and not knowing what to do, and the Union troops might just win the battle right there. At about noon, Confederate reinforcements start to arrive. And some were Confederate forces that had set up defensive positions in the area. They moved to where this battle appears to be taking place. And then, as we talked about earlier, some of those trains from the Shenandoah Valley are starting to arrive as well, including, at about noon, General Thomas Jackson's group of 2,500 Virginians, which play an extremely important role later in the battle. Now, the Union troops, on the other hand, are very, very slow to get organized. It takes them like 2 hours. They're green, they're inexperienced, they're overconfident. It's kind of a mess. None of these troops, these soldiers, these commanders really know what they're doing. They just thought they might have even won the battle, and now they're saying we got to keep going and fighting. It's kind of a mess. At 12:30, about half an hour later, these disorganized Confederate troops begin to rally on Henry Hill as Generals Johnston, who had come from the Shenandoah Valley, and Beauregard, who had been positioned there from the beginning, begin to take charge of the situation. They're kind of rallying their troops, and they're getting them all in order, and they're bringing more organization to what's going on. They take defensive positions on the eastern side of Henry Hill, which is really more of a large open plateau, and more reinforcements continue to arrive, strengthening their position. General Johnston, at this point, moves about a half mile away from that Henry Hill, which will become the battlefield. He's going to coordinate the arriving reinforcements, and General Beauregard decides to stay on the battlefield as the on-field commander of the forces there. So now we fast forward all the way to 2 p.m. It has taken about 2 hours for McDowell to organize his straggling, inexperienced troops, but he finally gets them ready to follow those retreating Confederates. He has lost the element of surprise, but his troops are marching due south from Matthews Hill. And again, I was just there yesterday. I walked it. You can really visualize it when you're there. So it's almost a perfect encapsulation of what the battle would have looked like and felt like at the time. So you have these Union troops walking south down Matthews Hill. They go through kind of a cornfield and a little bit of a forest, and then sort of more open fields, down a slope to a pretty important road crossing. One of those roads is the road that goes east-west to the Stone Bridge. And this famous house called Stone House, it was a tavern. It was sort of a restaurant and waypoint for people traveling. And during the battle itself, it becomes basically a hospital for wounded soldiers. They begin to encounter more of those Confederate troops the further south they go. They're sort of marching about a mile or two due south down these hills. And they are now looking in front of them at Henry Hill, where the rest of the battle would take place. So I want to take a moment and describe Henry Hill because it's not quite a hill in the way you might think of it. It's basically a large, flat, open area of farmland. The land was called Spring Hill Farm, and it was run by the Henry family. That's why it's called Henry Hill. And it was flat, wide, open. There are very few trees. And the Henry family had this one little house basically right in the middle of this large flat hill, kind of like a plateau. Now, these are very good conditions for a battle to take place. Usually, during battle, you want to take the high ground. Hill is going to be the high ground. And in this case, that high ground is quite wide. It's not like a little rolling hill or a mountain. It's this flat top of a hill. At the time, the farm was mostly overgrown and fallow, with just a small vegetable garden and an orchard next to the house. Now, why would a farm be fallow in Virginia? Well, it was because the only people who lived on the farm were an 84-year-old widowed and bedridden Judith Henry, her daughter Ellen, and a teenage slave named Lucy Griffith. Now, I can only imagine what things must have seemed like to this poor family. You have this bedridden 84-year-old woman, Judith Henry, and you have her daughter and this young slave girl, and all of a sudden you have literally tens of thousands of Confederate troops stationed right on your farm, and then to the north, tens of thousands more Union troops marching towards you. First, you hear the artillery shells go off in the morning. Then you see the troops marching past you, then fleeing past you. Remember, the Confederates sort of flee up to Henry Hill. Then you see the artillery of the Confederates shooting at the Northern troops who are coming towards them. And then, as we'll see, the battle takes place literally on their property, on their farm. Now, the Union troops are advancing towards the hill, and they don't know that there are civilians inside the house. And unfortunately for the Henry family, they actually target it with artillery fire. They figure that Confederate sharpshooters are going to take up positions inside, and they shell the house. Unfortunately, they kill the elderly Judith, but Ellen, her daughter, and Lucy, the slave, do survive. Judith, as far as we know, is the only civilian casualty of the day. And it really is an example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, literally the Civil War starts right there on her property. Instead of holding the entirety of Henry Hill, remember it's very wide and flat and open, for whatever reason, the Confederates decide to set up sort of a defensive position on the eastern part of the flat top of the hill. So as you're visualizing this, think of a big open flat hill, maybe half a mile wide. And on the eastern side, you have the Confederate troops setting up their defensive position. McDowell's troops march down that road. They're coming from Matthews Hill. They cross where the stone house is, and they are able to get up on Henry Hill as well, which was probably a mistake for the Confederates. They wouldn't have wanted them to get the high ground too, but they get up on Henry Hill, and they take positions on the northern and western side of the hill. And now the stage is really set for the battle. So basically, you got to imagine big, flat, wide open hill, poor Henry house right in the middle with Judith and her family. And then you have tens of thousands of Union troops on the north and west of the hill. And then you have tens of thousands of Confederate troops on the eastern part of the hill. And now the battle takes place. So like we said, it's about 2 p.m. and McDowell of the Union forces sets up 11 of his cannons on the northern and western parts of this large, wide open hill, but he does not reinforce them with infantry, which ends up being a huge mistake, and we'll see more about that later. The Confederates, on the other hand, set up 13 cannons on the eastern part of this wide open hill, about 300 yards away. So that is really how the battle is being positioned. You have cannons on one side of the Union force shooting at cannons on the other side of the Confederate force, about 300 yards away. The artillery begins shelling back and forth, and now the troops begin to engage. You kind of have to imagine this scene playing out. It's literally something out of a movie, but it's real life. The carnage is real, the blood is real, the death is real, and these troops, as we have said, were very inexperienced, very green. Many of them had just enlisted, literally weeks before, and they're seeing the carnage happen in real time in front of them. Different commanders give different accounts of the battle. There's a lot of praise given to the artillerymen, for example, for doing a good job and for troops being able to be cohesive and attack well. But, this is the first real engagement, the first real battle of the Civil War. And very quickly, it is very, very bloody indeed. So the Confederate troops, at least at first, seem relatively disorganized. But as the battle continues, more and more of those reinforcements arrive. And standing front and center on the Confederate side of the battle is General Thomas J. Jackson. He's atop his horse with his 2,500 Virginia troops behind him. And this is one of the very, very famous scenes of the Civil War, certainly one of the famous scenes of the battle itself here. Jackson is told that the enemy is driving at them. And again, you got to imagine this scene, tens of thousands of Union troops coming across this hill, attacking the position of the Confederates. Jackson's on his horse, and he hears all these troops are coming, the enemy's coming at them, and he looks down and he calmly replies, "We will give them the bayonet." So this determined, resolute resistance was noticed by many on the battlefield, kind of as someone to look up to and come behind, and he sort of had that inner strength, Jackson did. And in particular, the Confederate General Barnard Bee is trying to rally his very disorganized brigade. These green troops don't really know what they're doing. And he shouts, "Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let us go to his assistance." And that is how Thomas J. Jackson is given the famous nickname of Stonewall Jackson. Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let us go to his assistance. It works. It rallies the Confederate troops. They rally around the strength of this individual person. And sort of from there, there's a lot more cohesion in the battle and among the ranks. And some of this is certainly mythologized, but there is a lot of truth to the actual moment in time as it happened. So he's given that nickname. The nickname starts to spread quickly throughout Confederate ranks and eventually sort of enters the lore of the Civil War itself. Jackson becomes famous later on in the war, mostly for some of the battles that happened in the following year in 1862. But this is sort of his coming out party where people notice him as an important figure on the Confederate side. Unfortunately, General B, who gave him the nickname, suffers a very different fate. He dies later that afternoon in the fighting of that day. So the fighting continues to intensify, and at about 2:45, things start to change a little bit. So there's pretty intense fighting for about 45 minutes or so. More and more troops are arriving to the battlefield from both sides. There's stragglers on the Union side coming up to the hill and reinforcing. There's more troops coming from the Confederate side off those trains, from defensive positions. And by about 2:45, there's about 18,000 total troops on each side engaged in the battle. That's 36,000 people fighting. And again, put yourself in the Henry House in the middle of this hill. You're watching 36,000 people fight and die and kill each other. So at about 2:45, the tide starts to turn. The Union probably had the advantage up until this point. The Union Army had stationed two pieces of their artillery on the far southern and western side of this hill, pointed towards those 13 Confederate cannons on the eastern part of the hill. Captain Charles Griffin, got only 2 shots off when a group of soldiers started advancing towards his 2 cannons from the tree line. Griffin looks at them and says, "Oh my God, this is the enemy," and he's ready to engage them, but his commanding officer disagrees and overrules him and says, no, those are Union troops. Well, they were Confederate troops. A lot of this is probably due to inexperience. This is literally the first battle these people have really ever been in. There's also not really a standard uniform yet for the Confederates and the Union. Oftentimes you think the Union troops are in blue, the Confederates are in kind of that gray, but that's not always the case, especially early on in the battle. There's also the smoke and the din and confusion of the battle. Regardless, whatever the reason was, the Union troops think that these are basically reinforcements coming up, but they are not. This is the Confederate 33rd Virginia Infantry, and they advanced to within 40 paces of the two cannons. 40 paces is point blank range. It's only basically a couple hundred feet away. They level their muskets and they fire. The 33rd Virginia captures the guns. They kill and wound almost all of the Northern troops who had been manning those guns. It sort of shocks the North. And then here we go. The Confederates have now taken two important artillery pieces from the Union troops. This is part of the reason why it was so important that McDowell, the Union commander, reinforce his artillery with infantry. Because you got to imagine, if you're an artillery man and you're manning these artillery guns, these cannons, you're very susceptible to an attack, a raid, a bayonet charge by infantry on the other side. You need infantry around you to kind of protect you from that. They didn't have that, which was obviously a huge problem. And again, this is kind of the turning point. So those two guns are now taken by the Confederates, and now instead of 11 guns to 13 guns, it's 9 Union guns to 15 Confederate guns, and you can kind of see how the balance of power begins to shift. So from 3 to 4 p.m. or so, the fighting is still very, very intense across the entirety of Henry Hill, but it's mostly centered on those Union cannons. The Confederate troops realize that they're susceptible, that there's not really very many infantry protecting them, so more and more the Confederate troops are trying to capture them or attack them or press them. And eventually, they were able to capture almost all of the Union artillery. And that next hour or so, 3 to 4 p.m. or so, mostly the fighting is around these captured Union cannons, as the Union troops attempt to recapture them. The Confederate troops, for the most part, are successful in repulsing them. So again, you got to imagine this back and forth, like kind of cat and mouse game. Confederate troops attack cannons, capture them. Union troops retreat, some back to that stone house, that road just below the hill. They reorganize, try to come back up the hill to recapture them or flank them and come from the side. But the Confederate troops are able to pretty much hold firm and hold strong, and they keep them. So by 4 p.m., it's pretty clear that the Confederate troops kind of have the edge. The fighting continues. It's certainly not over yet. More and more troops are arriving, and there's still reinforcements coming from different sides and maneuvering. But by 5 p.m., it's pretty clear that the Confederates are going to be victorious in this battle. The Union troops abandon their attempts to recapture their artillery, and in total, they've lost 8 of the 11 cannons they had brought to Henry Hill. So the Union only has 3 cannons left, whereas the Confederacy had 13 plus 8. Now they have 21. Huge disadvantage, right, for the Union troops. The Confederates reinforce their lines and begin pushing the Union troops back up the way they had come, past the Henry House, off the hill, towards that intersection that we talked about before, that stone house that was now kind of being used as a hospital, and back up north the way they came, back up Matthews Hill. And I've been to the battlefield. You can go there too. It's really, really well preserved, like we had said. And you can sort of visualize standing atop Henry Hill, the retreating Union forces going down that hill, then going across that road, past the house, up the ridges and hills, up back to where they came, up north to Matthews Hill. And you can imagine sort of the terror initially here of the Union troops and disappointment, and then the elation of the Confederate troops as this is happening. Now, at first, the Union retreat is pretty orderly, but very quickly it turns into a rout. And what a rout is any time a force, instead of retreating orderly from a battle after they're losing, turns around and just runs because they're panicking and they're scared and they're terrified of being, killed. Now, what ends up happening in situations like that, more often than not, is those terrified troops are now much more susceptible to being attacked and killed by the opposing forces because they're so disorganized. So you have thousands of terrified Union troops running up Matthews Hill, running back north. They have artillery shells raining down on them from Henry Hill. They break ranks, they're running, and they're very inexperienced. So they're just literally, running for their lives. And again, you got to think about these Union troops. They had kind of been, maybe they were a farmer 2 weeks before. They're in Washington, D.C., being cheered on to take back Richmond and end the Confederacy, and all of a sudden they see a bunch of their friends die in a battle and they're running for their lives. It's got to be pretty shocking for anybody in a situation like that. Now, we mentioned earlier some of these interesting facts. The picnickers are watching this battle take place. These, citizens of the area, these politicians, they're popping champagne, they're in their carriages, they're watching from their picnic blankets. And all of a sudden now they're seeing tens of thousands of Union troops running at them, running in fear of their lives. And again, you got to put yourself in these guys' situations too. Imagine the terror they must have felt seeing not only the Union forces losing, but panicking, running through them, and afraid that maybe the Confederate troops would be right behind them to attack them, potentially kill them too. So it's a huge mess. But the Confederate troops don't really pursue very far. They're disorganized themselves. So the vast majority of those Union troops who had been able to leave the battlefield make it back up Matthews Hill, cross back over Bull Run from whence they came, and eventually return to Washington, D.C. Completely defeated, but at least saving the majority of their army from death or capture. So let's now talk about the aftermath of the battle for a minute. The main result was that both sides and the public at large were shocked by the results and bloodiness of the battle. To some, it was already clear that this war would not be the quick, painless affair that they had thought initially, and that reality was really starting to set in, that the outcome of this war was far from certain, that it could potentially last years and cost many thousands of lives. For the Union, there was this immediate fear that the Confederacy could invade Washington, D.C. I mean, you got to imagine the retreating Union troops are scared and they lost this big battle, and oh my God, are the Confederates coming for us? They didn't. The Confederate troops stayed in Virginia. But there was a general sense of alarm and concern that the Northern Army was not nearly as strong or as well trained as they thought it had been, and that defeating the Confederacy, which for most had seemed like a foregone conclusion that would happen quickly and easily, would certainly not be so easy and certainly not be as quick as they might have thought, and maybe wouldn't even happen at all. On July 22nd, Lincoln signed a bill that would bring in 50,000 more troops to the Union Army for up to 3 years. So that was the next day. As a result of this and the subsequent Union defeat 3 months later at the Battle of Ball's Bluff, Congress created what was called the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War, which investigated these early Union losses and ends up mixing politics with political strategy and actual military strategy for the remainder of the war, which leads to a whole bunch of headaches for Union military command. And specifically, in regards to the First Battle of Bull Run, the Union commanding officer McDowell is eventually relieved of his command and replaced by Major General George B. McClellan. For the Confederacy, they were pretty elated, as you would imagine. They had this boost of pride after their victory. But at the same time, they realized that total victory over the North, would not take, like they had thought, the months it would have taken. Initially, they thought, wait a minute, this actually could go on for years, and there's very likely going to be a large loss of life. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, for example, soon after this battle, called for the enlistment of 400,000 new volunteer troops, just to show you the sheer size of the army they needed, that they were expecting to need for this fight ahead. At the time, General Beauregard was seen as the hero in the battle for his efforts and was promoted to a full general of the Confederate Army. And like we talked about earlier, although Stonewall Jackson earned his nickname that day, he didn't really receive any widespread fame until later in the war, about a year later. So, on the whole, the battle really solidified the reality of the Civil War as a conflict that neither side would be able to claim an easy victory, as most observers had initially thought. The South was still very confident in their cause, as was the North, but the reality of a protracted, bloody war was starting to become clear, with some foreshadowing to the devastation it would wreak across the general population and American countryside. Again, think of the Henry family atop Henry Hill on their farm. It also made clear to both sides that their troops and commanders were very inexperienced and generally quite poorly trained, which is not a good recipe to win a major war, and that both sides would need to invest heavily in these aspects of the war to have any chance at ultimate success in any specific battles or victory in the war itself. So, just a note about visiting the battlefield if that is something you're interested in. I had a wonderful time visiting, and I am very, very impressed with how well they have kept the site there. It really is a wonderful way to experience the reality of what was happening during the Civil War. So they have a national battlefield park. It's called Manassas National Battlefield Park, and it's run by the National Park Service. And it's so well done and so professionally done. And almost everything that had to do with the battle is there and well preserved. For example, you go up to Henry Hill, and there's this wonderful visitor center, and there's a lot of great information in there. And then on the battlefield itself, they have really made it look like how it looked in 1861. I'll kind of go here in order of how the battle took place. The first moments of the battle take place at that stone bridge to the east of where Henry Hill is. And there's a walking path that you can go down with a parking lot. The stone bridge was destroyed during the Civil War, but they rebuilt it. And that rebuilt bridge from the 1880s, I believe, is still there. It's a wonderful walk, and there's little plaques that you can read with information. And it goes right over Bull Run, so you can kind of visualize how big the river was and how difficult it might have been to cross. And then you can go up to Matthews Hill, and you can walk all the way from that northern end at Matthews Hill down south as the Confederates had retreated, as the northern troops were following them. You can read all these little plaques, and there's a few even cannons set up to mimic how it would have looked during the battle itself. And then you walk south, you walk kind of down these ridges and these little hills, and eventually you make it to the Stone House, that hospital, that tavern that was turned into a hospital. The Stone House is really well preserved. You can go in there and visit it. It's great. There's fencing around it, kind of looking like the fencing of the day. And there's plaques everywhere, too, with all these great information, bits of information to read. And it's really just wonderfully done. And then you can cross that road to go up to Henry Hill. And again, everything on Henry Hill is just beautifully, beautifully done. So the Henry House has been completely rebuilt, and it looks great. There's a whole bunch of monuments and Civil War markers around it. There's even a little grave site for the Henry family, and some kind of reproductions of what it would have looked like on the farm at the time of the battle. And then throughout the battlefield, they have set up cannons and other pieces of equipment in the locations that they were during the battle. So where the Union had set up their cannon, they have a bunch of cannons set up. Where the Confederates had set up their cannons, they have a bunch of cannons set up. And there's walking trails everywhere with plaques everywhere, and you can just read all this information. It's a self-guided tour. You can basically learn it all just being there. And then there's paths all near the battlefield that you can follow to kind of take the trail that the Confederates might have taken from the railway station to the battle itself, or that the Union troops had taken as they were coming to the Henry Hill or retreating. So it was just wonderfully done. I was very impressed, and I absolutely recommend that you check it out. There's parking lots, big parking lots that are great. There's no issues with that, and it's definitely worth your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Educator Podcast, Walking History. If you're interested in finding more episodes of this podcast, please visit the educatorpodcast.buzzsprout.com or whatever site you use to get your podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about me or my work, please visit www.lifecoachingsd.com or follow me at lifecoachingsd on Instagram. This episode was recorded on January 28th, 2021, and all information is accurate to the best of my knowledge. Thanks for listening.